Hey guys, coming around for your 11/22/63 episode 2, The Kill Floor, and I was really looking forward to this episode. You guys know I really love the premiere. I thought it was a very solid series premiere for this mini series, and I was really looking forward to this episode. And not only was this episode way different than the first episode, but it was definitely better. I like this episode a lot more than the first episode, and not just because most of the first episode was just getting introduced to things here and there, but this was really a very intense, unpredictable episode. I really did not know what was going to happen here. And I was very interested because the main thing about this episode is that we know that Jake is going to go back in time. You know, that Jake is going to try to change things. He's going to try to change things, and he's going to do the opposite of what Al told him to change things and get attached, and those are two things that Al told him not to do. But let's get into this episode. There's a lot to talk about, and I really did love this episode. So we see it is now October 29th, 1960, which of course is 2 days before Harry's family is going to be murdered. As we know, they are murdered on Halloween night. And I thought we were introduced to the character of Harry very, very well right away, the way they did this. It felt like something out of a horror movie, but I think it really is a great way to show what bullying is like for young children. Harry's running away from some boys who chase him, ask him where he's going, and keep referring to him as Harry Fairy. He trips, they catch up to him, they spit in his face, pull down his pants, then throw them into the pond so he can't get them back, and they just leave him humiliated. I mean, he's completely humiliated, and the way this was done, every time he'd run, they kept, like, cutting to black like a horror movie, and that's really what it is for kids. I mean, one of the reasons you see so many kids committing suicide is because of bullying. It really is a very scary situation. I mean, especially something like this where Harry can't really control what's going on. He really has no control over them. They're going to do whatever they can. He knows that. He knows how vicious they are. And them humiliating him like that. That is one of the scariest things for a child to go through. And I think they portrayed that very, very well here. I really love the way that scene was done. And I don't think I said this last week, but everything about 11/22/63 feels very cinematic. Everything about it really does. And this episode especially, even more than the first episode. The first episode definitely had some things that felt like a movie because it was a movie length, but this episode in general, it just felt like a movie. It was really cool, and I love that. It basically felt like if you were to put it in a Stephen King adaptation on the big screen, this is pretty damn close, I gotta say. And unless it was, like once a week. Basically, that's what I'm saying. If it was like a feature and it was once a week on a big screen, that's pretty much what this is like. So Harry gets up, walks around town where everyone laughs at him for not wearing pants, and it's a very sad scene. You see he's being ridiculed. He goes into the department store where Jake is in, the clerk asks what happened, and Harry says that he did what he asked. He just kept running, but they knew somehow, and the clerk says that he's going to have to learn how to defend himself, and he thought Frank would have taught him that by now, and he asks if he can have the shorts, and the clerk says he doesn't know if he's doing him any favors by letting him stash them there. And Harry says he has to get to school. He gives him the shorts. Jake sees him bringing comic gestures to him. Harry leaves, and of course Jake had to keep himself as secretive as possible and not act like he knew him. And I think Jake did a very good job with that. I mean, that's something that's very hard for Jake to do, obviously, because he is a really nice guy and he really is a very caring guy. He really cares about people, and I think that's really a weakness for him here because he has to do some things that he's really not proud of, and we'll get into that. So basically, Jake says he seems like a nice kid. The clerk asks if there's anything else he can do for him. Jake says he's looking for a place to stay. The clerk gives him options on where to go, but he says he wants to find somewhere in Holden, and he says nobody stays there. Smell from the plants is enough to keep most from even stopping for gas, and we can tell right away this town is very corrupted. I mean, it's a very corrupted town. There's tons of crime going on. It's very violent. I mean, this is not a happy town like, where Jake was before. So Jake says he has a little business that he needs to do, and before he heads east, and if he knows of anything, Jake thanks him, and the clerk recommends the prices, Edna and Arliss price, and they rent a room usually to men with wife problems, and they're good Christians, and Jake says it sounds great. He goes to the prices location, and we get a scene that's very much like last week, with, I can't remember her name, but the boarding house, very much like that. She kind of just tells him how it's going, lays down the rules, tells him what's going on, basically, and Edna asks if he's really a writer. He says he's working on a book about the common man, and she asks if he's a communist, and he says he isn't, though most writers are. She says that they are Baptist, and she prefers reading the Saturday Evening Post, and Arliss is partial to Field and Stream. Jake says they're both run wonderful publications. She asks how long he will need the room. He says he will leave by the 1st of November. She says that she would have to charge him the full week rate, and he says it's fine. She gives him the rules of the house, and she tells him he owes $3 in advance, which, I mean, hey, that's awesome. But $3 was, to be fair, quite a lot back then. I mean, it wasn't a lot, but it wasn't necessarily, as cheap as it would be today. It definitely was worth more, and obviously Jake is pretty astonished, but I think that's one of the things that works very well for Jake, because he's like, you know what, this is a lot cheaper than it'd be back then. So that's definitely an advantage of going to the 60s. You remember Al said the 60s was amazing, and it really was. I mean, a lot of people say it was the greatest decade, and you really do see that. So we then see what remains of the sports stats and articles that Al gave to him. The only article that's easy to make out is one from 1963, when Johnson becomes president, which doesn't seem important, but becomes a lot more important at the end of the episode. We will definitely get into that. And because Jake doesn't have these articles to rely on, and he doesn't really have Al's help, he's basically forced to just try to remember Harry's paper as best as he can. And they have a lot of scenes in this episode of Jake just trying to remember Harry's paper, trying to memorize it so we can get all the details. It was a very effective way to do this, because yeah, that would make sense. I mean, without any sort of recordings or anything, he can't really do a lot. So he kind of just needs to rely on his own, because Al can't really help him, because he has nothing back to look on, because most of his stuff is burnt. So he goes out, meets Arliss, and Jake asks if they're going to have many trick-or-treaters on Halloween. He says that there should be a few. Jake says he might go sightseeing. Arliss recommends him Sammy's townhouse, and then warns Jake that Edna's not someone to be trifled with, and he's basically saying that Edna's very suspicious, so definitely watch out. And you definitely see that throughout this episode. Edna is definitely, someone that is very in tune with things, and she very much knows the reputation in the town. So Jake heads to the bar, asks the bartender Bill Turnicoat for a beer, who becomes a lot more important later. We'll get into him. He asks if they know a guy named Frank, and Jake introduces himself and tells him that he's writing a book, and the bartender asks if it's about Frank, and Jake says that he was just told to find him if he was ever passing through. Bill tells him if he wants a table, he better get one, because the plant's about to let out, and I thought he was talking about the nuclear power plant, but that's not what he's talking about. We find out later what he's talking about. So he sits down, notices all of the chaos going on within the bar. I mean, everyone's really scrambling. I mean, there are people, asking Bill for drinks, treating him like shit. I mean, it really is crazy. And then once Frank comes in, though, everything just seems to, stop. Everyone just sits down, takes their seat. I mean, you can tell everyone is very fearful of this man. They know what he does. They know the kind of man he is. And I gotta say, Josh Duhamel, I at first thought was, I was kind of like, what? Josh Duhamel, really? Because I see Josh Duhamel as the leading man in romantic comedies. That's really all I've seen in romantic comedies, romantic dramas. But he was amazing here. I really think they got to channel this side of Josh Duhamel we haven't seen before. I thought, was completely unrecognizable in this role. He transformed this character perfectly. He killed it, and especially for a guest appearance where you could have just half-assed it, he really did perfectly as Frank Dunning. I mean, this was a really spot-on portrayal, and I gotta give him credit for that. Honestly, I think he's Emmy-worthy. I really think he is. So Jake introduces himself and tells him that he's writing a book, and the bartender asks if it's about Frank. Oh, I just read this. So Frank comes in, someone tells him the drink is on him. Jake watches as Frank takes his seat, and you can tell how fearful Jake really is. I mean, he knows what kind of man Frank is, and he tells the man to make it a double bourbon. Frank greets his friends. Bill tells him that Jake is there for him, and Frank says all the rounds are on him. He goes up to Jake, introduces himself, and introduces him to his friends Calvin and Dickie. They sit down, and Frank says that Bill says he's a writer, so he has to be an astronaut, because Bill gets everything wrong, we find out. Kind of a fun joke there, but Jake says he got that one right, and he says he has a lot of shit to deal with, and maybe Jake can bring in a little light from the outside world. Jake agrees to it. Jake speaks a passage from Jake Agee's book, and he says he knew what it was like to be a man and what made them great, and saw guys like them, the little guys at the bottom, struggling in the dirt, because that's where the real stuff of life is. And yeah, that's kind of true. I mean, when you really think about the pioneers, I mean, a lot of them weren't high class. They were very, low class, and they kind of just, everyone who becomes high class, they have to get to low class to get to high class. That's just how it is, and I really do agree with Jake on that. So Calvin says he should tell Frank's wife that because he is the one sleeping on his couch. Frank says it won't be for long. Jake says, and that line is disturbing as hell, because we know what that means. I mean, of course they don't, but we know that means, to any other one, it'd be just like, oh, right, it won't be for long. But we know that means he's going to kill his wife. We know that. So That line's even more chilling. Jake says he knows it's hard and he's divorced himself. Frank says he's not divorced. Jake says maybe sometimes it's better just to walk away from his problems. And Frank says he doesn't have any of half of what he just said. He doesn't have any, and half of what he just said went right over his head. He tells Jake every writer needs a great first chapter. Jake agrees, and Frank says he's going to give him his, and we don't know where he's headed, but we know it's going to be somewhere pretty dangerous. And Frank drives, and Jake asks where they're headed. Frank says he will see. Frank says that Bill tells him he knew him, and he doesn't know how. And Jake says he didn't tell him he knew him. There's a guy in Lexington who told him if he's ever in town, he should look him up. And I like the way that Jake is doing this. I think he's playing it really cool. He definitely is getting in tune with things, and I like seeing that. I honestly was very worried about Jake going into the 1960s, but doesn't seem like he's had much of a problem in terms of having to cover himself up. I think he's doing a very good job with that, honestly. I really, a lot of things that he's saying, sure, they're not believable to us because we know how the world is now, but to other people who don't know how anything really is, in 2016 and things like that, no one really is suspecting anything. So, until this episode, we'll get into that. Jake says he must have known him from the service. He's short and a bit of a joker. Frank says it had to have been someone named Woody Nelson, and Frank asks if he's written before, and Jake says that this is his first book. He asks what it's about, and Jake says it's a ghost story, and it's called Halloween Town, which, that joke in general just made me laugh. That was very Back to the Future-esque, if you remember. Things like Back to the Future that always came up, like, for example, him saying his name was Darth Vader, things like that. You guys can just, there are literally a dozen references in Back to the Future, and I can't go through all of them, because they're just so funny. So Carl and Dickie laugh in the back seat. Frank says they couldn't write a book like Jake could. Frank says that they've arrived and it's a meat packing plant where Frank works with Carl and Dickie. And Jake asks what they're doing there. Frank says they're going to have a little fun. He sees his boss Clayton and he tells them that they're not supposed to be there this late. Frank says he wants to show Jake where his hamburger comes from and tells Clayton to take a smoke break for 30 minutes. Frank tells Jake his family has been in the meat business for 3 generations. His grandfather used to travel from farm to farm, butchering whatever they had handy in the front yard, and tells Jake that he is the one that taught him how to use a knife. Jake looks around the slaughtered animals, and Frank says that his father worked in the building his whole life, but they never went hungry, and Jake says he sounds like a good man. Frank says his mom loved him, and pretty much any ounce of compassion or humanity or anything like that that we could have had in Frank, like anything like, if we cared about him or anything like that, that is gone after this scene. I mean, after this scene, no, this guy is very bad. And Frank says, for as long as there have been slaughterhouses, the worst job that he could possibly have was to work the hide cellar because of the flies. He says no one has worked there in a month or two, and Frank says the heat and the salt are one thing, but once the flies crawl up inside their ears, they start to live there. Jake says he can't be serious. Frank says they start to lay eggs. He then brings Jake to the kill floor, which, yes, that is what this episode is named, for a good reason, definitely. And he tells Carl and Dickie to bring him a sledgehammer, which, again, very chilling line, because we know that Frank murdered his family with a sledgehammer. And Frank says that when his father worked the kill floor, they used to call him the Bambino, because just like Babe Ruth, it only took him one swing. So Frank says when he was working down there, it was never quite that easy, but he's had a lot of practice since. Carl and Dickie then come back with the cow, along with a cattle prod for the cow, and Jake says that he doesn't want to hurt if he gives Jake the sledgehammer. Jake asks if they use guns for this, and Frank says that only the chicken shits, special bullet melts the brain nice and neat, but they want to see if he was really a true man, and he tells Jake to go right between the eyes and tells Jake to think of the cow as Christy. Jake puts the sledgehammer down, and he just can't bring himself to do it, for 2 reasons. 1, because he's not a violent man, that's just how he is. 2, he knows that this is the weapon that he's gonna kill his family with, and of course, since Jake's trying to prevent that, that's one of the reasons why he's not just gonna go out and kill this cow. That really did make sense to me, so Frank picks it up, just slaughters the cow, which I'm glad we did not see, because I know a lot of people are saying, oh, we should have seen that, but no, that's not something we need to see. Frank says he guesses some men don't have what it takes to do that. Jake is just horrified, obviously. He can't believe what he's seeing. He's never really seen anything like this before, and just knowing that that's how they did it back then, I mean, is really crazy. And I don't know if they still do it like that today. I can't think they don't do that today, because they definitely don't, but that's pretty crazy. So Jake at the Price's house hears about an event shown in the sports stats. He then goes to the Dunning's house, and his wife Doris answers. She at first thinks it's a sales call, and he says he's with the Howard Johnson organization, is here to deliver her and her family Kenny the prize package, which Harry's excited to hear about, and then gives her a brochure to a landmark for hungry Americans and gives her tickets to Lexington Halloween Festival. Basically creating a distraction so that way when Frank shows up, they won't be there, which I thought was a very well done plan, honestly, because that doesn't mean he has to kill Frank. He can just distract them. He can, basically just send them there. They can be enraptured by what they're seeing, and he won't have to kill Frank, which I thought was a very smart idea. In hindsight, the problem with that, the reason it wasn't as great as an idea, the reason it wasn't as great as an idea, is because of what ends up happening. We'll get into that though. So basically, he says sometimes fate just steps in and deals you a good hand. He asks how many will be joining her. He says herself and 3 kids and no other adults. He says he hears that there's a costume contest in the lobby if she's interested, and he tells Harry that things are about to get a lot better. And Jake and the Prices are basically, he's really just trying to do a good thing here. He's trying to do a good thing, and obviously she doesn't know why this is going on. But yeah, I mean, fate kind of did put her in the right direction here. So it really seems like this is going to work out very well. So Jake and the Prices are then watching a debate between Nixon and Kennedy. He thanks Edna for the dinner, and they argue about what it tastes like, and which I thought was a pretty funny scene, honestly. I like the way this was done. Edna says that she'd vote for Eisenhower again if he ran, and she says that Arliss served under him in World War II. He says it's no big deal. She says he got the Bronze Star and wanted to frame it up in the house, but he won't let her. And then we get this amazing scene between Arliss and Jake. By far the best scene in the episode, okay? Every scene in this episode was great, but this scene, just the monologue in general, just the pain that Arliss was going through, this was incredible. This really was. I absolutely love this scene, because Arliss asks Jake if he served. Jake says he did in Korea for 2 tours, and of course, we don't know it's true. He asks what Jake says that it was MASH 4077. Again, another fun reference there. Edna asks if he wants coffee and leaves. Arliss says that they both knew the truth, and Jake asks what it is, and Arliss says that there's no such thing as a war hero. Jake says sometimes people have to do terrible things to make the world a better place, which kind of is the theme of this episode, which, we'll get into why, but basically, the scene on paper might not have seemed relevant or necessary, but I think it's probably, honestly, the most necessary scene in the episode. Arliss asks if he wants to hear about the Bronze Star. Jake says he does, and we get a very chilling story about Arliss when he was in Sicily with these 2 guys that got separated and that Nazis were heading up their asses, and his friend, Fuzzy Brokowicz, took a shot in the head just above the right eye. Part of his scalp went down his shirt. He tried everything he could, but he couldn't get over it. I mean, all the war stories you've heard of, that's in here. And he says the other guy, Ernie Calver, twisted his ankle when they cover, so he's completely useless. And he says when it got dark, they left off for some reason, so he hauled Ernie onto his back, made a run for it, ended up down the river, and it seemed like they were in the clear. That's when he saw a German kid, couldn't have been more than 17, asleep on the bank, wandering away from his unit. He says he could have just gone on and left him there, but he kept thinking that maybe he's the one who pulled the trigger on Fuzzy, and he says he put Ernie down because, of course, if this is the person that killed his friend, I mean, who knows what he could have done. And he went over and dragged the kid to the water's edge. He was so sleepy, he didn't even wake up till he put his head under the water. Then his eyes opened, but he didn't struggle at all. He just looked up through the mud and the slit, his face, the color of a fish's belly. Then he opened his mouth and said something just before he died in German that Arliss is unsure because he doesn't know German. And he says after a while, he pushed him out into the river and let the current take him. He says he then picked up Ernie, headed off into the woods. Hours later, they found the rest of the division, and next morning, the CEO comes into his tent and tells him that he's going to put him up for the Bronze Star. He says the last thing you can say about killing a man is that it's brave, and just an incredible speech. I mean, everything about it. Yeah, that's true. They really had to do some things in the war that really don't seem justified, but there were reasons why they had to do that. I mean, it was really every man for himself in that war. But because he wanted to avenge his friend's death, he couldn't bring himself not to do it because he had every reason to do it. I think it was really something where Arliss was thinking, should I do this or should I not? He really had no other reason but to do it, and very crazy stuff, but I really love that the show did that scene. Amazing scene, and just, we heard a lot of war stories, but nothing quite like that. But that definitely is what was going on in the war. There were things going like that every day. I mean, that's what's so scary to think about. And that is why I think we fear war so much, because we know the stories. We don't really hear all the graphic details like that, but just knowing something like that was going on, probably going on, like I said, every day, is crazy to think about, and I think they did that perfectly, I have to say. Because they could have done it very contrived, but no, it came out very genuine and very, very scary, I have to say. So Jake is left stunned, then hears a knock at the door. It's Frank, who right away Edna is not happy to see at all, because again, she knows a lot about the town. He says he's looking for Jake, but Edna says he didn't inform her he was expecting guests, and he says he thought he'd just drop in because that's the kind of guy he is. Jake says okay. Frank says he thinks they got off in the wrong foot last night and wants to make it up to him. Jake hesitantly agrees, not really knowing what his agenda is, but figures, hey, if I befriend him, maybe I can prevent this from happening. Plus, I think Jake was thinking maybe he could distract him as well, because of course his family's going to the festival. They then head out. Frank gives him a beer to drink and tells Jake not to spit it out since he made it fresh this morning. Jake says he hopes up he cleans the bathtub beforehand, and Frank says he's a funny guy and the humor is important. He says they're not all rubes. Some of them have good qualities and values, and Jake says he never thought otherwise. Frank says then he has something for him. He brings him to a butcher shop, and he says it's his pride and joy that got him out of the slaughterhouse, never look back. And he says he, like most, then that it is his place and his rules. He says it's rules that hold the universe together, and when rules are broken, there's a price without that, everything just falls apart, and the price must be paid to make things right. And then Doris comes out, and this is when things get crazy. I mean, any plan that Jake would have had to not kill Frank is ruined after this. She is a black eye. Jake tells him to stop. Frank tells her to show Jake the tickets. He says it's not what he thinks. Frank says it looks like he's trying to have sex with his wife. He literally thinks that he's trying to seduce his wife, and Jake admits that it was what he was doing. Obviously, he can't say the real reason because he'll make himself look crazy, so Jake basically says, yeah, that's exactly what I was doing. But she didn't know anything about it and had nothing to do with it. And of course, she has a black eye. He knows what he's going to do. Frank kicks him, tells Jake she's not worth it, then literally throws him out of the butcher shop. And he says if he was him, he'd get in his car, drive away from the town, never look back. Doris comes out, he says he's sorry, and she leaves. He then goes to and I mean, there's not really much he can do there, so that really sucks. So he then goes to a sporting goods, sees it's closing. He tells the shopkeeper he needs a little gun, and she asks what he's planning on doing with it. He says he just wants to shoot cans. He gives her 40, and she refuses, says a man like him coming around to get a firearm and doing nothing good can come out of it. She then laughs, asks if he can take a joke, says she'll give him 5 guns, and with the gun in hand, he now knows he has no choice. He needs to kill Frank. There's no way to get out of it. Knowing what he can do to Doris just from that, he knows that he needs to kill Frank. That is the only way to neutralize this and fix the situation. So we cut back to the present, and something I liked about this episode, like I said, is that we don't have many scenes with Al. There aren't many times where Al can just go out and tell Jake, okay, this is how you do this. Jake can't really do that a lot here. But he does remember one very significant conversation in this episode, and I think it's good that they're doing this because I do want to see Al. Chris Cooper is great as this character. They did a great job with it last week, and he is a very important part of this show. So I'm glad that they're still trying to incorporate some things because we didn't hear that full conversation in the basement. That went on all night, as we know. So every episode, I'm pretty sure, is going to give us a little snippets of Al. Maybe it will get tedious, but right now, at least, it's working, and I think they're doing a very good job with it. So when Jake asks Al about the past, why the past doesn't want to be changed, and pushes back and asks how he knows, and Al says when he first started going through the rabbit hole, he saw a news story about a girl in Lisbon who got shot, crippled in a random hunting accident. He tried to fix it, but every time he did, something would come up, like a fender bender or a flat tire or a tree in the road, and he says he tried countless times. Now this girl is pretty much Jake's, Harry. That's Jake's Harry, and basically he says he didn't have and basically he says he knows it sounds strange and both random and not random at all violent, and he says he didn't have cancer before he went in, and Jake asks if he's asking him if the past gave him cancer, and he says all he remembers if he got a full checkup before his last trip and nothing was wrong with him. And I'm glad that we got that because I was wondering last week how to get cancer. The past seems to be the villain of this show. Like, the past seems to be a literal element that fucks up your life, and in Al's case, it gave him this cancer. So Jake then wakes up, throws up. He says food poisoning won't stop him from changing the past. He then asks the pharmacist that they have Gatorade, then realizes it's not invented yet. Just kind of a fun scene. He says he needs to hurry this up or he's going to put on pads right now. He gets medicine to help him get over the food poisoning. He then recites more of the paper from Harry and heads out to kill Frank. He leaves the house and stands outside thinking, really, how is this going to play out? Am I going to survive? Am I going to get out of this? What could come of this? Could I make the situation worse? I mean, there are literally so many ways this could go. He could end up getting Harry killed. That's what I thought was going to happen. I thought Harry was going to die in this episode, and Harry was going to be erased from existence. That's what I thought was going to happen. That's not what happens at all, though. We'll get into what actually happens. He goes to the Dunnings, sees the situation play out exactly as Harry wrote it, with him headed to a costume party and his mom's last words to him, which, is crazy to see. But before Jake can do anything, and he is reciting everything that's going on pretty much as he's seeing it, because it just helps him remember. And before Jake can do anything, he's grabbed by Bill, who tells him he isn't going anywhere. And Jake asks what he's doing. Bill says he's asking him the same thing. Jake asks if he's Frank's watchdog, and Bill says he hates that son of a bitch, and Jake says he does too. Jake says if Frank is coming to kill Doris and the kids at 8 o'clock, they're going to die at 8, and Bill asks if he told them that, and Jake says it's complicated. Then Bill says he killed his older sister, Clara. Frank was married to her 12 years ago and killed her and buried her body somewhere, her and the baby, and nobody believes it because he was just a kid at the time, and Jake says that he's going to do it again, and Bill says he doesn't know what's going to happen, and Jake admits he's from the future, and he knows Harry in the future, and of course Bill thinks that he's batshit crazy. That's what he's thinking, and Jake pulls a gun on him. Bill says if he wants to kill Frank, he'll kill Frank, and he's not going to stop him, but he's got something wrong in his story that it's 8:05, and Jake at first thinks that maybe he just stopped it just by staying in the door, which is very interesting, but then once he hears Doris scream, he's like, oh shit, I gotta go there. He realizes he went out through the back door. He goes upstairs with his gun ready, sees Harry in his room, tells him to promise him no matter what happens, he will not come out of there, and this was a genuinely intense scene, and Jake then enters the room, pulls his gun out at Frank, tells him he shouldn't be here. Jake then shoots him, but not fatally enough. The two are viciously fighting. I mean, Frank is just coming at him with anything he can get, and Frank tells Harry to bring the sledgehammer. Jake finds a wire, strangles Frank with it. It spurts blood out and kills him, and just killed him right then and there. And you may think that's a good way to end it, but it really applies back to what Arliss said, that killing, a man is anything but a hero, and this very much applies to that even though Jake did make things right, he still killed him, and that knowing he killed him, that is definitely going to eat up inside of him. He's going to be, he's not really going to know what to do about it, and, I mean, this is Jake we're talking about. He's a good man. He's not a bad person, so definitely this is going to eat up inside of him, and I'm very interested in seeing where exactly Jake is going to go with this, because this could definitely get very interesting as to seeing what's going to happen there. And Jake then leaves and tells Doris point blank, do not go into the bedroom, which obviously she shouldn't. So trick-or-treaters wait outside. Everyone wonders what's going on. Jake leaves the house, and a kid asks if that's real blood on him, and he's then approached by Edna, who asks him if he's done trick-or-treating, and he says he just wants to leave. She says she might owe the sheriff a call. He says to not do that. He says no matter what it looks like, he didn't do a bad thing, which he didn't. He did it to save someone he really cares about, and she says that God knows what's in his heart, and he will be the final judge, and she hopes that he's prepared for that. And while Harry still may be slow, he is definitely going to be a lot different when he sees him again, because Harry is going to be a lot more experienced in this sort of thing. Harry is definitely going to know what he's doing. He's going to definitely things are going to change with Harry, and I'm definitely interested in seeing what happens there. And basically she says that God knows what's in his heart, and he will be the final judge, and she hopes he's prepared for that. He gets into the car, approaches a rainstorm, gets out, and the score to this scene was amazing. And a lot of people said this was like the reverse Shawshank Redemption, and it very much is like that, because in that scene, he feels free. He finally feels free. He finally feels like he's not being told what to do. But here, Jake realizes he's now trapped, because he's trying to get the blood to go away, and it's barely gone. I mean, basically, he keeps reporting Doris and Tugga and Ellen's name, realizing that they're all still alive. Just a great scene, and basically then Bill sees him, shows him an article he has from 1963. Now, how Bill got this, I don't really know, but he asks him what it is, tells him to get in, and that's how the episode ends, and holy shit, what an amazing episode. Guys, I'm really loving this show, I have to say. This was another amazing episode, very solid stuff. I'm really loving where the show is headed. But like I said, what is he going to do? How did Bill get this article? That's really what I want to know, because I don't really know how Bill got this article. We'll have to see what's going on there. Jake, him killing, this is definitely going to eat up inside of him. I think he is going to regret killing Frank, but at the same time, he did the right thing, and he knows that, but he just doesn't feel right with doing that, because that's not the kind of person that Jake is. He's a good man, and good men, like he said, don't kill, and that's just something that eventually is going to come up again. We'll have to see what's going on with that. That definitely is going to get very interesting. What changes in Harry's life? That's what I want to know, because I'm sure we are going to see that at some point, what's going to happen there in Harry's life. But of course, Frank, we know, Jake has to stay in the past if he wants to change things. So unfortunately, because of that, he's going to have to wait a very long time till he gets to see the present, Harry, because obviously he does want this to remain something that's changed. That's just something he wants to do. However, I do think he's going to realize that the past is definitely coming, gonna push back, and he doesn't know how. He doesn't really know what the impact of that's going to be, what's going to happen to him. We'll have to see what's going on there, but next week is going to be incredible. I can't wait to see what goes on with that. That definitely is going to get very interesting. And then Edna. Edna's definitely suspicious of Jake. This is not the last we've seen of Edna. I'm saying that now. I think Edna is definitely, she's going to play a bigger role in the show than we think. Let me know what you guys saw this episode. This was an amazing episode. I'm really loving this show so far. Can't wait for next week's episode. And we'll see you guys in my next show, which will be for Better Call Saul. And we'll see you guys for that. Okay, bye.